Andy.
Thanks very much, Bijou. The main conclusions, I can see nothing very problematic in that from my own knowledge of the bank's CDD programs. They're not all that surprising. I'm familiar with Susan Wong's piece, which took, I think, the subsample of World Bank CDD projects that had either experimental or quasi-experimental evaluation. And it came to, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, something like 40 out of 500. And that study found, if you like, more positive lessons, but in a sense it's not inconsistent with your findings in the sense that they were a set of projects that had used quite sophisticated impact evaluation methods as they were proceeding. And that's one of the factors that you pick out for success. So I'd just be interested in your view on that. One quick question about the sandwich, the top down and the bottom up. In terms of giving the conditions for the sort of top down accountability, top down enforcement, I wonder if behind that you've got a major element that is the existence of some kind of political project that sees a long-term and stable interest in building these kinds of community structures or local structures. I believe that probably was there in Indonesia in that famously, you know, more on the positive side experience. And that kind of stability of, if you like, structure, support and motivation, I suspect is absent in many of the other cases, even where they probably were well designed, maybe famously the NSP in Afghanistan. But just a thought about that top-down part is maybe not that easy to get in terms of the political conditions which make it feasible and which enable it in the long run. Anyway, thanks very much. Thanks for the presentation.
That was Andy Norton, Director of Research at ODI. That's fine. Next. There's one there and then one here.
Ian Quick, I'm a consultant here in London. I think I agreed with you right up until the last point on monitoring and project stuff at the bank in particular. It does seem that like you're doubling down on a institutional structure that, as you said, is designed to do one thing and perhaps can't be easily repurposed to do something else. Should not that effort be shifted to the pre-project phase, sort of situational awareness, to look at where there is a policy window on the one hand for certain types of change, or identifying actors that are promising a sort of venture capital model, rather than loading up on a project that's already designed, already executed?
Thanks. One more here, and then I got one online.
Sorry, your name was?
Ian Quick.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
There's one more here.
Hi there, I'm Charlie Ensor. I'm here with some of my friends. We're all UCL master students. I'm actually doing a thesis on post-conflict governance in Sierra Leone, and I guess one thing Vijay said quite chimed to me was the idea of lack of country context specificity. I mean, in 2004 in Sierra Leone, there was the introduction of local councils, which was supposed to bring this country ownership. But one thing that worries me about the context there was the lack of understanding of institutions that already existed, such as the chiefdom setup, for example, and that's something Lenny alluded to quite quickly. And I think there's a lot about elite capture, but if you're looking at the context of Sierra Leone, for example, this chieftain system is something that people have deference for. It's something they've it's an institution that's really embedded in local cultures, and it's an interesting context because there's this trade-off between traditional forms of institutions and governance and more modern, and I guess that there needs to be maybe a taming down of the language to really value local actors. And for me, centralisation can work if this hybrid form can be met. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that each country is country specific, and that this idea of country ownership comes from within, rather than from the language of PRSPs, for example.
Okay, thanks. I have one question online, then I'll get back to Biju, and there will be time to do another round in a minute. I'm aware that we have one main speaker and we're putting a lot of questions onto him. So the very last one, from Ted Mauro in the US, who's an educational consultant. I think I say Mauro in the Italian way, it might be Mauro. What is the research results on the role of the private sector, and any suggestions for the future? Back to you.
Back to me?
Pick up
Okay.
some
Wow,
questions.
okay. Firstly, thanks so much, Lenny and David, for your kind words, and David for, I guess I should not say the book is boring. I spent 5 years writing it, so it's actually, it was a fascinating journey, and tremendously sort of a journey full of learning on our own part. Ghazala and I learned so much about what everybody was doing and saying. And one of the interesting things, what David and Lenny said this, is that what we ended up saying is actually what a lot of people are saying about these kinds of projects. It's not different, and that makes it more real. You know, we were not. I mean, it's a literature review, yes, but it resonates with a lot of what a lot of people are saying, except those who have a vested interest in wanting to say some things to keep their jobs, to promote their agendas. And hence, I come to one of Andy's questions on the Susan Wong paper. Yes, she's my colleague. But she runs those projects, you know, and she spearheaded the attempt to discredit the book within the World Bank. And so that paper was an attempt at that. We looked at exactly those same evaluations, every one of those that Susan looks at in that paper, we look at in our book. And look at the difference in interpretation, okay? And we looked at it dispassionately, we had no particular agenda. She has an agenda, we don't, that's the difference. And you'll see a big difference in interpretation. So yes, I mean, I don't think the bank's projects are doing so wonderfully and everybody else is doing so badly. Just that, you know, the bank has a very good publicity wing, some of which tries to pass itself off as research. Okay. Sorry, Andy, I had to say that because I think that paper comes up again and again, and it should be seen in that light as who's writing the paper and why they're writing it. Okay. Let me come back to some of Lenny and David's points. So a lot of interesting comments here, but let's come to some of the questions at the end because of lack of time. Should we disaggregate models of participation? We tried to do some of that in the book, but I don't think we do as good a job as we could. I mean, there's already 350 pages, but I think there's something really interesting to do is to sort of look at the different modalities of participation, what do each of them mean? I mean, if I would write a second book, it would probably be along those lines, but that's not the second book I'm writing, so somebody else should do it. How do we change things? Let me come back to that at the end. I want to spend 5 minutes on that. So I'll come back to this question that came up from other people as well. Sorry, I got something here. Citizen engagement from the World Bank. Yeah, so the bank is now saying citizen engagement everywhere. You know, in principle, that's a good thing, right? I mean, you want citizens to participate everywhere. The question is how you're going to do it. And if it is going to be in such a way so that citizen engagement is going to actually have a feedback loop, and those voices are going to be heard in a way that actually change things, which means that you're going with a sandwich, then it's great. Otherwise, it's just going to be a forum for people to scream and shout. You know, Obama, when he became president of the United States, had this online forum where anybody could say anything, and so we're going to learn from all this. And what did 90% of the comments something about wanting to legalize marijuana? You know, so, which is fine, but you know, there's a lot of things the U.S. government has to do. So the question is, how is it going to be done? You know, and so you know, great that they're saying these things. I would wait and see how it's actually done in practice. David's points. And there's several important points to think about here. One is the issue of elite capture. No, David, I do agree with you actually on elite capture. I think it's a far more complicated issue than it is made out to be. Elites sometimes need to lead. I mean, Marx would have said that, right?
I mean, it relates to Charlie's question about chiefs in Sierra Leone.
It does, yeah.
I mean, if the only problem was that the chiefs were getting a bigger slice of the action than everybody else, but the consequences were good otherwise, well, let's have elite capture.
Yeah, and in fact, what I found in all my years of doing research looking at village governments in India is that sometimes the most corrupt village president, and they have to play the very careful game between stealing enough so that you know, they're happy with the job, but also delivering so that people are resentful that they're stealing. Everybody knows you're stealing. So this whole idea that people don't know what's going on You know, we have to have citizen participation. People can be aware of everybody knows everything that's going on. The question is, do they have the power to do anything about it? How do you empower them to take that information and turn it into some sort of check and balance? That's what's not going on. You know, so, but I agree with you, David, that elite capture is actually a tremendously interesting, and it's not just capture, it's elite, it's you know, I wrote a paper sometimes trying to, some years ago, distinguish between benevolent and malevolent capture. I think that is a distinction that needs to be thought about. I think the question is, how does elite, what is good elite dominance, what is bad elite dominance? Do you need elite dominance? And I think when and where do you need it? These are all extremely good questions, and I agree with you. Fads. So, you know, what's interesting, and we go into this a bit in the book, there's the history to all of this stuff, and the history goes back a long way. And the big boost, I mean, you know, there's a colonial history, and you know, a lot of this decentralization stuff, the participatory development actually started back, people following Mill and Rousseau and so on. So both the French colonial traditions and the British colonial governments around the world brought in a lot of participation in different ways, some worse, some than others. But what was interesting is after World War II, when there was a big push towards development, the Ford Foundation, USAID, all of the organizations started bringing in participatory elements to the development projects. Saw this all over the world, like explosion, just as you see today. And Howard White has called that the first wave of participatory development. That was killed. Why? Because books like mine came out and said all this stuff is elite capture and it's terrible, and you know, and this has basically killed it, and it all became decentralized. And so then you had this big centralized top-down development that came. So what we're trying to do is, please don't do that. You know, we're not in the business of trying to kill this way of doing things. We're in the business of trying to fix it. So therefore, in some ways, I value the pushback we're getting from people like Susan and others, because that's preventing the stuff from going away. I just wish they would be a little fairer about it and not try to get me fired, you know, which was, or try to censor the book, which is the other thing they tried to do. So you know, that's not productive. What is productive is pushing back with debate, okay? And I wish there was more debate around it, because I think that's important. So I'm not necessarily right. The truth probably is somewhere, it's going to emerge out of some sort of debate and argumentative Indian type of conversations, which is what I am. Okay, now let me come back to this issue, how do we change things? And that's sort of an issue that came up a couple of different places. Ian, just to come back to that question, monitoring and project stuff at the bank, you know, I'm prefacing your question with my response to this because I have a response to your question. I think it's an either or. You've got to do both. Yeah. I mean, what the vendor, I mean, I just came back from Silicon Valley 2 days ago, so I'm full of venture capital guys. And that has a bearing on what I'm going to say, because they're very excited about what you're trying to do. And those guys, it's not that they stop monitoring when they give the money away. You know, they're looking very carefully as to see how these guys are spending the money. They're trying to help them. I mean, there's a new show on HBO, by the way. I don't know which channel is going to come in the UK, called Silicon Valley. I highly recommend it. It's actually a really, really funny, lovely show. And the main venture capital guy that is constantly checking to see how these guys are doing and giving them direction and moving them around. It's always a sort of learning from failure. The venture capital model is about learning from failure at the end, right? It's not about letting many flowers bloom. It's actually saying which flowers bloom and let's promote those flowers because everybody wants those flowers. Yeah? So monitoring is essential, as is a priori efforts of design, efforts of trying to figure out what works and what doesn't. I don't think there are contradictions. So what do we do with monitoring? And it comes back to questions that both David and Susan raised. And I want to talk a little bit about what I'm trying to do in India, because you know, when I wrote the first draft of this book, the vice president of the South Asia region came to me and said, "Oh, great, you're writing all this stuff. It's easy to criticize. We're in the real business of doing real work. Put up or shut up," right? And you know, hey, that's a challenge, right? So then she married me to a fellow called Parmesh Shah, who runs livelihoods projects in India. Livelihoods projects are there are a $5 billion portfolio across the South Asia region, $3 billion in India alone. These are things where you have these self-help groups of women, you have these structures, and then once those structures, the self-help groups are set up, you roll out all sorts of anti-poverty programs on top of them. They're all over the country. There's a National Rural Livelihoods Mission anyway in India now. So she married me to Parmesh's projects, which were a project in Bihar and the National Rural Livelihoods Mission, and a project in Tamil Nadu, which is not Parmesh's, but a chap who many of you might know, called Kevin Crockford, wonderful guy, who I partner with. So Kevin and Parmesh are the two guys I partner with in Tamil Nadu and Bihar. National Rural Livelihoods Mission didn't work out so well. I'm happy to talk about why in private. But Bihar and Tamil Nadu did. And what we've been doing there for the last 2.5 years, I'm just going to have a blog and development impact on this sometime this week, is basically what we're saying is, look, how do we set up these systems? So the first thing we're doing is moving away from the idea of MIS systems, management information systems, all that monitoring matters, management information systems. No, we have to have a decision support system. What does that mean? Firstly, the data has to be accurate. When we looked at MIS systems for these projects, and this is all getting a little techie stuff, but it's the hardcore stuff that matters. We saw that these data were being collected for World Bank supervision. So when the World Bank manager came, they would see all these lovely PowerPoints with all these numbers thrown about. They were never being used for everyday decision making. The World Bank guys were not there every day. My team is there every day watching actually have. Nobody uses these numbers for anything except for the World Bank guys. Often these numbers came with a 6-month to a 1-year lag. When you're going to make decisions, everyday decisions on the basis of data, if your data is 6 months old, they're basically useless, right? Secondly, one of the guys who ran one of these monitoring systems told me, very strong South Indian accent, what are you saying? Monitoring, evaluation, monitoring and dying only, okay? So he didn't understand me, but he said, it's not monitoring and evaluation, it's monitoring and lying only, okay? So that's how they thought. It's the ways of manufacturing data to make the project look good. That was the task with the monitoring system. How do we fix that? The first thing we did was incentivize the data collection to the people whose interest it is to make sure the data are accurate. Nowadays, it's the women themselves. They are the ones who collect the data. They are the ones who enter the data at a village level computer, and they see immediately whether the data is accurate or not. Any fudging, they can see it immediately and get it fixed. Okay, because it's data on their credit records and stuff. It has implications for their lives, right? So the data everybody knows is accurate, and because it's entered in the village, this is Tamil Nadu, it's immediately available. So what we've been trying to do then is to take that data, have it in the cloud somewhere, but then bring it back in dashboards from the village level upwards. So decision makers, the village level fellow, the cluster level guy, the state level guy, all these people can see these dashboards and see what's going on in ways that make a difference to their decision making. So immediately every village is being tracked, every facilitator, central actors and all this, the facilitator's performance is being tracked. It's really amazing. That's one thing. Right? That's a decision support system. I can go into this part, that's why Silicon Valley is interested. And I can talk about something else. Process monitoring. This is stuff that we all talk about, never done. It requires, when you write process monitoring reports, and you all know what this is, so I'm not going to go into it, they have to be executive summaries. You give somebody a 1,000-page report, I ain't going to read that. Nobody's going to read that. So have executive summaries of these process monitoring reports, and then what we do is make sure that those executive summaries are discussed and they're actionable reports. So every 4 months you get a report of this kind. They see what's going on. What is a process monitoring report? It's about trying to look at the quality of implementation, right? Implementation problems, what's going on. It's qualitative stuff. Decisions are made. People are fired. People are promoted on the basis of these reports. They matter. Okay. So now suddenly process monitoring has become a way of tracking things in the project. Second point. Thirdly, the role of impact evaluations. We use impact evaluations for long-term learning. Impact evaluations take 3 years to do, and they create research, and we're doing that to check some experiments that we're doing to check the overall impact of the project. But you also need more short-term evaluations. Propensity score matching stuff that we've done to get immediate, quick sense of what's going on in the project. Do that all the time. You use both, not just one tool. We do mixed methods evaluations. It's not just getting the damn impact numbers at the end. Why did you get that impact number or not get it? I spent as much time focused on the qualitative work that in these evaluations as in the quantitative. That's changing the picture of understanding mechanisms. What do we do with these numbers? How do we use them, right? Then, what is amazing, inspired by Robert Chambers and others, how do we use modern technologies to make data work for people, that is empower people, so that they own the data? What we do as researchers, we take data and run away with it. Robert has said from all his life, that's something screwy about that, okay? And I'm a great believer in that. As much as I might write a book like this, I think Robert Chambers is one of the great gurus that we have around. And so how do we translate? This is what we're doing. We got women in Tamil Nadu, 1 million women, to have representative groups that came up with a half-an-hour questionnaire that said, what are the big things that you want to track in your life over time? What are the indicators of well-being that you consider important? Not me, Biju Rao, who's written 40 surveys, but them, because it's surveys about their own lives. And they came up with a half-an-hour a question with a set of indicators. What we're now doing is that we're using tablets to get women from village A to go to village B and survey the women in that village with these tablets, right? So that the data is immediately collected. We call it peer tracking, P tracking, okay? And then what we're doing is working with the MIT Data Hub and the Media Lab people at MIT, this again by Silicon Valley is interested, to turn this into visualizations that illiterate women who are not numerically literate can appreciate and understand. Instead of having them sit around in a group and draw graphs on the grass, we're giving them a tablet with visualizations that they can understand. We're spending a lot of effort to make sure those visualizations work. So they immediately see what the data mean to them and therefore get empowered by the data. And we're going to do this every year. And it's going to be tied into the MIS systems. Then they can also track how this is working out of their credit records and everything else, right? It's all, of course, anonymous. We might release the data, but we'll be stripping all their names out of it. But to me, that's another exciting effort. So I call this the social observatory, right? And the reason I'm excited by this is because this came out of the book. But I think it's really an alternative to the pure impact evaluation model of assessing things, or the pure sort of qualitative model of assessing things. There's somewhere in between, trying to bring elements of that together to change how projects see themselves. And I think that kind of work is necessary to make induced development work. Yeah? So that's an answer. Oh gosh, other questions. Sorry, that was a bit of a lecture. Yeah, ownership, Charlie, should come from within. I totally agree. Without that, it doesn't really work. And Andy's extremely good point on the sandwich. I totally agree with you, Andy. It has to come from a long-term political project. Otherwise, it's not going to work. And that's a commitment. And that means, that, as you saw in Malawi, you get these pendulums. In a democracy, you might get a pendulum anyway. One party's going to agree with it, one party's not going to like it, and that does happen. But if it's in India, what's happened, how you cure that is by putting in the Indian constitution. Like, no political party can get away with it. They have to deal with the reality of it. So that's changed the dynamic, right? But the question is what you do. Somebody's talking about post-conflict countries. What do you do in post-conflict countries? What do you do? So what's interesting in Colombia has an election coming up next week on June 15th. That's going to be basically determined on the peace process, right? And they're competing visions. One vision is the FARC are the bad guys. We shouldn't be dealing with them. We should be just suppressing them, throwing them in jail for 6 years. The other vision is Santos's vision, current president. Let's use this as an opportunity to change the political dynamic by having grassroots participatory decision-making within a democratic system, very much along the Kerala lines or the Brazilian Porto Alegre lines. And he's asked some of us to help him. His peace commissioner, Sergio Jaramillo, has asked us to help him design that, right? And that's a beautiful opportunity. That's a political moment that you take advantage of to change things. Now, if he loses the election, that's the end of the story. So I obviously have my candidate a week from now. I'll be looking at the papers carefully. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think, in other words, it can happen in post-conflict situations. You can have that commitment. If you don't have it, for God's sakes, don't try to sell a product that's basically snake oil, right? That's my worry with a lot of us development types. We sell this anyway, whether that political commitment is there or not. That's a little crazy. Yeah. I think I've answered all the questions, haven't I?
So you might have a few more coming.
Okay, fine.
Okay, let me start with a couple offline. After your impression on the heavy South Asian accent, 5 questions came straight away from our online audience. I'm not sure. Okay, one is from Sumet Rao from GSDRC. I think you've touched on that already a little bit, but he wants to know more specifically what's the appetite in the World Bank and other donor agencies about learning from failure and long-term projects, and any suggestions how that can be improved. Then we got a question from Paul Alerts in Uganda, who want to know more about the community, the co-funding by the community having negative effects, as taxes are often advocated to promote ownership. So something you touched on in your presentation. And then Flaminia Fumagalli, GIZ in Malawi, who would like to know more, for you to deepen a little bit your discussion about intrinsic motivation versus aid donors-driven action, and particularly how to access relevant literature or debates about that. And then there is one final question on social protection, but I'll leave it for a moment because we got quite a lot on the plate, and there might be someone else here. Go, please.
Hi, thank you. Gareth Wall from the Commonwealth Local Government Forum. You did touch on it just towards the end, but I was intrigued, first off, as to why ODI decided Malawi was the most useful example to give in this discussion, because, as you said, there isn't local government, and the main positives that came out is when you have elected local government, you might get, there is some evidence that there is some benefit, and that came up, but both the responses didn't seem to pick up on this. And I'm interested because ODI has other work from Ghana and elsewhere that does draw out some of this and the issues of Malawi. So I don't know whether the lesson is, okay, you have an authoritarian top-down approach if you don't have national consensus and constitutionally backed decentralization. Is that the answer, or is there something else in there? Thanks.
That's one more. Alina.
Thank you. Alina Rocha Menocal, Research Fellow, Politics and Governance. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about the importance of organizational capacity in terms of being able to make a difference, because perhaps one of the problems is that if you just reduce participation to being able to click on something online, that is part of the problem. And a bigger manifestation of this would be what has happened in Egypt.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Soren Janvik. I'm unaffiliated. Two kind of short questions. First is, it appears to me that you wrote the executive summary for the report 10 years prior to the report with your working paper from about 2002. It's, I think it's called Those Participation Work as well. You could argue that Agrawal and Gibson wrote the same thing a handful of years before, or even that Norman Long wrote these things in the 70s, and I'm sure you can find of others people. So why, I appreciate the real data being collected, but why did you have to write the report now, and why won't I be able to write the same report in another 10 years? Because I'm not entirely convinced that mixed method monitoring and dashboards are going to drive the change alone. And then the second part of the question, which I'm going to try to disguise as a question, but it's a bit of my own answer to it, is that there's surprisingly little mention of institutional theory or institutions beyond formal institutions in the report. You speak about the nexus of accommodation, and then there's a lot about institutions, or it's theorized the same way as Douglas North take on institutions. And I was wondering if you assume a model where institutional change will happen in a punctuated equilibrium, and I was wondering if that really suits the experience that you have from all these.
But could you explain where you're coming from? I'm hearing your questions, but it'll be helpful to know if you know a little bit about you.
It's the thing
What's
is.
your training? Where are you coming from?
I've worked in development for.
Are you an economist, political scientist, or?
International development studies, public administration and development
Okay.
studies.
Right.
I worked on a World Bank and DFID funded project, by the way, in Kyrgyzstan. That was a community-driven rural water supply project. Okay. And what I found there was that the way the project was designed was far too static on its view on institutions. I very much agree that when you look at the very poor communities, they simply don't have the resources to take advantage of it. But then as there are more resources in the communities, it became a lot more complex. There was a relationship between resources and then project outcome up to a breaking point, after which it became completely random how well the communities did. And my own sense is that the contemporary institutional theory is inadequate for really designing these projects for the future. And
Can I answer these?
Yeah. Okay, let me see if there is. Okay, I think go ahead. Oh, there's one last here, and then we'll get back to Vijay. Quick, please, because we've got 8 minutes once I read this.
I'm Raisa. I'm Charlie's classmate from UCL. And I was working on a community scorecard project in Bangladesh. And one of the problems that we face, it's very hard to get women to participate in citizen forums, and how we can get them, even there were probably like 2 out of 10 participants, and even when they were there, it was very hard to make them speak up. So what is the way to encourage them? And also after the community scorecard was done, the results were being shared in public meetings where the local MP came, and the results were being shared, and the MP would make some promises, but then the project is over, so nothing's being done. So what's the way to work around that?
Thanks. We've got 7 minutes to go. I'd like to ask Biju to respond, but also give a chance to Lenny, also was one question, particularly on Malawi. Maybe David, if you've got any final thoughts. So Biju, go
Sure.
first.
So let me take them in order. What's the appetite for learning from failure in the World Bank? I mean, the President of the World Bank has declared that development is about the science of delivery and learning from success and failure. So, that's what it's saying now. And that's after our book came out. So I think we have to wait and see whether that actually happens and how they actually absorb those lessons and do it. The answer to that question is let's wait and see. Right? Co-funded by the community. Why is that not a good thing? I mean, theoretically it could be a good thing or a bad thing. The evidence seems to show that it acts as a regressive tax. Projects that don't do it tend to benefit the poor more. They tend to rely on the backs of the poor a little bit less. I mean, I would suspect that if you have any sort of social welfare framework, you would not want to tax the poor more than you do the rich. So it's a simple point. Malawi, I'm going to leave that, and the questions around it, I'm going to leave that to Lenny and David to answer. Similarly, Garrett's question. Elena's question on organizational capacity in Egypt. I mean, the organizational capacity is essentially important, man. But organizational capacity can matter in different levels. The organizational capacity of the state, the organizational capacity of the implementation agency, and the organizational capacity of the community. And what is civil society, social capital, which is ultimately organizational capacity, right? How effective are they at getting things done, at making decisions, and so on? And that can vary, right? And that variation needs to be factored in when you're kind of figuring out how to do these projects. Variation at the village level, even, yeah. And also in design, at how good is the organizational capacity of the state to implement the sandwich, and that's the other part of the story. Egypt, one of the interesting things about this is the story of the trajectory. We don't think that by doing this you're going to have a clean and nice process where everything comes back to Soren's point. It's not going to work like some theorists, Douglas North included, is going to tell you how it's going to work. Okay, I'm sure Doug North will tell you that. Right? Nobody knows how these things are going to work because they follow unpredictable trajectories. Who knew that the Arab Spring would result in the election of the chief of the head of the army? I mean, who knew, right? I mean, civic participation takes all sorts of turns, right? And ultimately we hope it goes towards the place where we want it to go, but it'll be lots of ups and downs in that process.
Yeah, no, I think the main point there is that the irony is that of course you have this flourishing of people using social media and what have you to bring about change, which really took the world by surprise, and they were able to bring down a system. But then when it came time to actually capitalize on that momentum, the fundamental lack of organizational capacity from those people who were the ones who occupied Tahrir Square in the first place came back to
what I'm trying to say is that I'm not just an organizational capacity that made the difference. It's that when you bring diverse bunches of people together to make collective, to do something collectively, it could go in totally unpredictable ways. It's impossible for us as social scientists to know how that's going to go. And that comes to Soren's question. Now, firstly, Soren, just a correction. I mean, I don't know where you got the sense that our 2004 paper was the same as this book. It's entirely different. This book is a 350-page book. That's the 30-page paper. You're really mischaracterizing those things, and I'm actually quite angry about that because you clearly either have not read it or you have a political agenda behind where you're coming from, because that's completely wrong. They're entirely different pieces of work. Our executive summary was the exec summary of this book. It's certainly nothing like that paper, right? So you either maybe you don't speak English is not your native language, but you're not getting what we're trying to say in the executive summary. So that's a mischaracterization, and I don't like that. Yeah. Now, if you have an interpretation, I'm happy to take your criticism, but that's not criticism. That's the mischaracterization. Now, let me come back to some things that you say that I do agree with. Theory cannot tell us how to go. Theory cannot tell us how to go. That's my view. It can inform us, give us some sense. I mean, I'm just rereading Asimov's Foundation series. I don't know if you read it. This whole business of what he calls psychohistory, where there was this genius predicting what the world is going to be like 5,000 years from now. We're not there. Social scientists, we're a very, very inadequate bunch of people. We don't know, we barely have begun to understand social interactions, barely, right? But we have to do development. We're in this strange place where we don't understand human behavior really well, but we have to do something to get people out of poverty, right? So how do we use whatever little bit of knowledge we have to make that better? My view on that is that we learn by doing, and we do by learning, right? Because we cannot figure out how to do this well right in the beginning. That's why whatever tools we can have to figure out how we do things better incrementally is what we use, right? We don't rely on theory. If you want to have a debate on theory, I'm happy to talk. I've read every theory out there, trust me. Yeah? But that's for my own understanding. It's not how you do projects, I think, right? What projects can do, what you have to learn about projects is what the question on context. You have to understand what is the social structure, what's the political structure, how do they work? And that's some theory would obviously inform that, and that's very helpful. And that can help you design better. But ultimately, it's very empirical. It's an empirical project, not a theoretical one. The theory can help you give you directions. It can help. It's very important in that it can help you say that, look, that sort of makes obviously no sense, but it has only limited ability. Now, people may disagree with me on that. I'm happy to, I mean, my own chief economist disagrees with me on that, right? He's an economic theorist. He thinks theory can tell you a lot more than that. I disagree, yeah? And I think honest people can disagree on that issue. On the first point, nobody can disagree. You've mischaracterized the book, right? Okay. Raisa, wait, question. How do you get women to speak? Let me give you a quick example. So what we've done, Bihar, which is on the, shares a bottle of Bangladesh? Yes, I think it does. So, women won't even, you go and ask a woman, what's your husband's name? And she won't tell you, right? There's a project there, trying to, Women's Empowerment Project, work with very closely. 3 years later, after doing a lot of this community building stuff and trying to do it well, they not only do that, they collectivize, they try to make decisions that help make collective decisions to the village. There are women really made a difference. We're writing a paper that we're calling the unmaking of gender, trying to understand. What it requires, right, is 3 things. I mean, it requires an unpacking in our South Asian context of the nexus between power relationships, patriarchy, and gender. It's not just gender, right? Everything has to be inequality. All these come together, right? So when a project tries to do all of that and does it well with the political commitment that Andy was talking about, it can happen, right? And now there is some evidence to show that just reserving seats for women can do some of that, and yeah, you can make small gains that way. But for real change, you need to attack it on different fronts. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, I'll just hold you for a couple of other minutes, but I want Lenny to come back on the question of Malawi and then see if David has some final thoughts.
Thank you. Just very quickly, Gareth. I mean, I think the reason why I think Malawi is an interesting case to talk about in this respect is that actually there's been a whole, often donor-driven agenda around decentralisation and around different forms of community participation that has been promoted in Malawi, despite the fact that it actually doesn't meet a lot of the enabling conditions that I think Biju's work points need to be there for it to have any effect on outcomes. So if we're talking about learning from failure, then I think it's a really good case to start from. But it is an archetypal sort of problem case in that respect. But I think it's interesting. In terms of what do you do about Malawi, well, I would say come to our event on Thursday, which will be here, 12:30, where we will be discussing the findings in more detail and looking ahead about what the recent elections mean and what the opportunities and challenges are going forward. I do think that as much as sort of a re-centralisation might make sense, decentralisation is here to stay in Malawi. It has a lot of political backing now at different levels, so it's hard to roll back from. And there's probably a lot we can learn from this work around, solving different kinds of collective action problems at different levels, tapping into intrinsic motivations. There's a lot that we'll be picking up in a couple of days' time. So please come back for that. Maybe my final comment would be to Biju. I hope that your next book will look at some of this work in Tamil Nadu in more depth, because it sounds like this approach to trying to sort of close and shorten some of the feedback loops is an interesting one, and I would great to see more evidence and documentation of it. Thank you.
David.
Let me try and link up 2 things. I mean, one, Andy Norton's sort of comment about the problem with the sandwich and the question from Malawi about how to access people's intrinsic motivation. In the research that we coordinated here based on fieldwork in Africa, we also came to the conclusion that the bottom-up stuff works when the top-down stuff is really strong. And as a matter of fact, our problem with that was that the only example we could find of that happening was Rwanda, right? One small African country. But interestingly, when I presented some of those results at IDS, Robert Chambers was very sympathetic in the end to that idea. That's also the lesson that he's learned over the years. The climate for successful participatory stuff is actually better when there's seriousness from on top about transforming things in the rural areas. But as the instance of Rwanda illustrates, I mean, Andy's right that it's a problem. We actually don't have too many regimes in the world which have that kind of political vision at the top, which is both stable and oriented towards achieving serious change. So we do need to think about what we're going to do in all of the other places. And I think that the key to tapping into intrinsic motivations is probably down the road of following venture capital models. These experiences I've been looking at recently in the Philippines have that combination. The guy in the Asia Foundation who's largely responsible for making it happen is very influenced by venture capitalism in the IT sector. So to the extent he's following a model, he's following a sort of Steve Jobs kind of.
Remember, there are lots of bankrupt venture capitalists.
Yeah. But his approach to finding people with intrinsic motivation to achieve breakthroughs in reform is to try out several groups, see how they get on, terminate those that hit an obstacle and do not come up to expectations, and support and drive forward and motivate the others. I think that's applicable even in Malawi, for some of the reasons that Lenny was giving. Very unfavourable national contexts can be places where you can achieve breakthroughs if you're prepared to think about it in this other kind of way.
Okay, thank you. 2 quick thoughts from me. Watch this space, because I think there is something coming up here, both from learning from Bijo what he's doing in Bihar and Tamil Nadu, and maybe picking up some of this sort of spot the intrinsic motivation and learn from those experiences that I can see coming up on the horizon. In case you haven't picked it up yet, there will be another event here on Thursday on Malawi, going into some more details about the findings of the research and the elections. And with those sort of promises for future events in our mind, thank you very much, Biju, for coming and for the energy and the challenges that you point to in presentation. Thank you all, and see you at ODI sometime very soon.
Thanks very much.
Thanks.